All right, just to keep us on track, I am just going to kick us off with our first couple of slides here. As many of you know, my name is Sally Hollingston, and I'm the WEN Colorado chapter president. Super excited about our event today, but before we get started, I just wanted to share for those that are not WEN members, just share a little bit of information about us and what is coming up on our horizon for different events. So as many of you probably are already aware, we are a membership organization that empowers energy professionals by building a diverse community through networking, education, and professional development. We have on the screen here, we have a couple of fun WENCO facts. One of them being that WENCO stands for Women's Energy Network Colorado. Another is that one that I'm super proud of and I like to highlight every time we do one of these events is that we are over 500 members, active members. Our theme this year is Be Resilient, which I think many of you have probably seen that come in a variety of ways through our programming. So hopefully you're all resonating with it. We never knew it would be this timely in 2020 to have that theme, but it's been working out really well for us. And then as a reminder, our memberships are open to both women and men. So we are welcoming of all professionals in energy, regardless of the sector, as well as the gender. So we hope that if you know of anybody that's interested, don't let them think the name Women's Energy Network. Don't let that scare them away. So please invite them to join us at an event and maybe join us for membership. So we have a lot of upcoming virtual events in July. We have July 8th, Adapting Advocacy. This is actually going to be presented by two of our Western Women's Energy Network colleagues. It should be a great webinar in the morning. July 16th, I'm super excited about this partnership with the Denver Petroleum Club. It's a drive-in movie night. For those of us that are familiar with the Denver Mart off of 50th and 25, there's actually a drive-in movie theater behind there. So we'll be hosting it that night featuring Goonies and Top Gun. And then on July 22nd, if you're a new member or you're still waffling on membership, we have a free WENformation session for people to join and learn a little bit more about what we do and all the things that we can offer. Our next lunch webinar will be on July 29th. It's the State of Women in Energy, sponsored by Tallgrass, Travelers, and Upstream. And that'll be a great session that includes Kristen Blessman with Colorado Women's Chamber and Jan Coleman, who is the mayor of Thornton and also works at Whiting with me. And then finally, we just confirmed yesterday, Kaylee Van Cleve, our president-elect, will be hosting on July 31st and August 1st, 2 different fly fishing adventures. So those will be full day opportunities that are in Frisco, Colorado. So all of these events will be up on our website. If not by end of today, then definitely by tomorrow. So we encourage you to get registered. And then as you probably are aware, we have our new WENCO Water Cooler podcast, and we are dropping new episodes on those the first and third Wednesday of each month. So you can find those on Apple, Spotify, Google, and then we also have them online on Anchor. As always, you can find us on social media. So we hope you do look for us and if you want to do a screenshot today and tag us in LinkedIn or Facebook, that would be awesome. But without further ado, I am going to turn over the reins to Jacqueline Vogel, who is with Tri-State, and she is also on our leadership team of WEN Colorado this year, and she will be doing the introductions and managing the Q&A and chat for us today. So Jacqueline, welcome.
Great. Hi, I'm Jacqueline. I am co-chair of the Energy 101 committee that we have within WENCO. And today we are going to welcome Jonathan White from National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Jonathan is the manager of the Secure Cyber Energy Systems Group within the Energy Security and Resilience Center at NREL. He was also the chief engineer for the Department of Energy's Scaled Wind Farm Technology Facility. And some of his credentials, he earned his doctorate and master's degree in mechanical engineering, the best engineering, from Purdue University, and his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from The Ohio State University. Jonathan, will hand it over to you for our demo, and you can explain what you're going to show us today.
Great, thank you. See by miracle if these slides come through. Okay, is everything coming through, I hope?
Yep, looks good.
All right. I realize while doing it, it's funny to be displaying a presentation in front of you instead of to the audience. It's a whole new experience, this environment that we're living in. So anyways, so thank you. Thank you to the Women's Energy Network for allowing NREL the opportunity to speak today. Thank you, Jacqueline, and everyone else who's helped arrange that. So the goals of my talk today are to hit a little bit of what we foresee is most critical going on within the energy system, especially from a resilience and cybersecurity perspective. I will say, just saying cybersecurity is it's a massive problem, right? Because you're talking about, the internet, you're talking about network, email, corporate networks. And then even if you get a little bit specific and you say, I'm going to talk about energy cybersecurity, it's still a massive problem, because you're talking about, the bulk power system, you're talking about the edge of the grid, you're talking about generation, you're also talking about markets, you're talking about balancing authorities. So not just any one kind of simple problem. And so within the scope of what I'm going to chat about today, I'm going to focus mostly around the portfolio that NREL is focused on, which is what I would say is cybersecurity of the emerging energy system. And by emerging, what I mean is the new types of things that are coming onto the grid, and how can we secure those? So there's 17 Department of Energy laboratories. NREL is one of those laboratories. Most of those laboratories have cybersecurity programs, and a set of about 5 laboratories are heavily involved in the energy system cybersecurity. And so as you do that, just think it subdivides in terms of where NREL really focuses. And so again, as you might imagine, we focus within the cybersecurity of renewable energy, and then the changing on what we call the grid edge. And when we talk about grid edge, right, we're talking about smart neighborhoods, electric charging stations, smart campuses, next generation manufacturing facilities. So we're talking about end users. NREL we don't focus as much within cybersecurity of the bulk power system, which would be more in line, for example, with Tri-State and what they focus on, WAPA, BPA. Those are kind of what you think of as really big bulk power kinds of applications. So what we're focused on is the grid edge, but also, as you all know, the grid edge is where things are changing very quickly. There's a lot of things coming on within homes and campuses. There's a lot to do there. And so there's a lot of concerns, although there's also a lot of opportunities that I'll chat about here in a moment. I would say that I'm going to go through these slides, but I would really encourage any kind of interruptions or questions. And then Jacqueline or whoever, if you just kind of interrupt me, I'm not offended. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep going through that. But happy to do questions as we move through this. I said just a little bit about myself, in addition to what Jacqueline mentioned, is that I'm not a cybersecurity professional by training. I'm more of a controls, physical failure trained engineer. And so I was part of a wind farm that had a catastrophic failure about 6 years ago, and got really interested in failure, especially failure from malicious endeavors. And so I started my career at Sandia National Labs down in Albuquerque before having the wonderful opportunity to move up here to Colorado with my family a little bit over 2 years ago to lead this group. And it's been a great experience. And I can't imagine a better place to live and have kids than Colorado. So let's do a little movement there. So again, I'm going to kind of flow down in terms of where does NREL, where do we kind of view the world? Where do we sit? What are the kind of what we call the critical infrastructure threats that we consider? I'm going to dive a little bit into cybersecurity relative to the energy system, and then I'll hit on a little bit of the kinds of projects that we work on at NREL. So, and again, many of you are probably already familiar with this. So what's been really fascinating, at NREL has been the continued heavy momentum shift away from fossil fuels. And of course that is, driven by policy and things like that. But what's interesting is that even with, varying policies or we'll say less impassioned policies, these trends still continue, that there's still this shift away from fossil energy towards cleaner sources, so natural gas as well as renewables. And that momentum seems to be sustaining. Of course, I know I have personally not seen any studies in terms of, how our current, pandemic will play into this. So I don't have any, of course, foreshadowing what that will matter and how that will play into that. But prior to this, I can say these trends were robust and they were going on for a long term, the shift towards renewables. And of course, one of the big things that was driving this is, yes, there's a drive for green and cleaner and all that, but frankly, they're just cheap. They're just becoming very, very cheap. They're some of the cheapest forms of energy, when appropriately sited, right? If you put wind in a part of the country that's not windy, it's not going to be very viable. If you put solar in a cloudy part of Ohio, where I grew up in, it may not be so viable. But when properly sited, wind and solar are incredibly cheap. And they're also, as we get more of it installed and it becomes more geographically dispersed, the variability, although sometimes high locally, geographically, the variability isn't as high as we thought, right? There is more, I would say, kind of storage, almost capacitance, if you think about it, built into your system on a geographic scale. And so it's kind of those things that as we install more of these, you would think our system would become more variable, when in reality, what's happening is as we install more, it's becoming more stable. Although, of course, right, there's local issues, there's harmonics, there's all kinds of challenges. It's not to negate those. But the point thing is that we're able to bring a lot of renewables on, they're really cheap, and we're not seeing the need to have as much storage as everybody foresaw, where it would just be this massive storage that we would need, and we would need it everywhere, and it would double the cost. And that doesn't seem so far to be the case. There are things that challenges to overcome, but because of that, these trends are occurring. So out of that is really NREL's primary mission. So of the 17 labs, we are the National Renewable Energy Lab. So our priority is on developing the technology, the standards, whatever we can do to support science-based understanding of renewable energy. And frankly, more recently, that's had more to do with integration. The wind turbines, solar are many decades in development. They're robust systems. They're built and supplied by some of the world's biggest companies. So they're very robust systems at this point. They aren't prototype kinds of things. And so because of that, because the solution is very viable, now the question is, how does all this interplay? The grid wasn't designed to deal with this. It wasn't designed for this many of inverters. It wasn't designed for this level of communication, which is something very important to my group, right? When you take a single coal plant that has a manned staff who are there with physical security, and you replace that with several hundred wind turbines that are not manned. I mean, they're remotely monitored, but they're not manned every day. Their physical access is definitely possible, and sometimes possible for months between, when people visit those, and the fact that those 100 turbines are interconnected, they're controlled remotely, as opposed to somebody who's actually sitting, on the facility running them. That's very different. That creates a very different kind of security situation. Same analogy, of course, for solar plants, right? You have thousands of inverters and panels that aren't manned, they're remotely controlled. And so it just brings in new kinds of security challenges. So anyway, so of the 17 labs, NREL focuses on renewable energy and integration. And so therefore my group, and we of course don't do like the corporate cybersecurity, that's a different group. My group is a purely research focused group, and we support the mission of the lab, which is renewable energy, and then questions around integration. So right now we have about 25 researchers in my group, plus about another 4 or 5 interns, so a group on that scale. And then we support all 2,300 researchers at the lab. So anytime there's a cybersecurity research question, whether it's technology, training, policy, standards, any of those things, we staff to support those efforts. So NREL is subdivided, what you could think of as in 4 different areas. So there's one area specifically focused around renewable power. So that means solar, wind, water power, and geothermal. Water power is a little bit more than what you might think. That's why it's named water as opposed to hydropower. So water power is inclusive of hydropower, but water power also includes things like wave energy devices or current-based devices. And when I say current, think about a wind turbine, small, made of metal, that goes in a river or goes in a tidal basin. So that's a current-based energy device. Most of the water devices outside of hydro are pretty nascent and not heavily deployed. We also have an area around sustainable transportation. So relative to what we're talking about here, most relevant would be electrified transportation, electrified autonomous mobility, and what are the security questions that come into that? Energy efficiency, so that goes more onto the buildings and commercial control systems, as well as then that leads into manufacturing facilities and efficient next generation manufacturing facilities. Again, lots of security questions around all of those control systems. And then the last area is energy systems integration. And so that's kind of where we bring it all together. So how do we take all of these different components, bring them into a system, and then study those integration challenges? Cybersecurity, we actually sit within energy systems integration, but we support every single program that's on this list. So one thing that I want to introduce is that we focus on, the topic of this is really cybersecurity, but I want to kind of introduce a higher level principle that what you really kind of start your thought process with is energy security and resilience. Of which, cybersecurity is a piece of that. But when you think about energy security, you also want to think about, security from natural disasters, not just malicious endeavors. And you also want to think about not just security, but you want to think about resilience. So on this next slide here is where we kind of introduce the concept of security and resilience. They are sometimes used interchangeably, and it's a little bit dangerous because they're really two different approaches. Security is, in my words, preventing something from happening. So it doesn't have anything to do with discussing once something bad has happened, but security is saying that like this thing cannot happen. Like, this attack cannot happen. This hurricane cannot cause this. This flood cannot do this. That's what security is. Security is stopping something. It's preventing something from occurring. Resilience is the acceptance that things are going to happen, and then how am I going to respond and recover to that, as well as in a degraded state, how am I going to continue to operate as best as I can through a degraded state. So today we're going to talk about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, mainly we're focused on trying to prevent things from happening, but we also accept that in certain systems, because we don't own them, because there's so many of them, that there's going to be vulnerabilities, and they're readily exploitable vulnerabilities. So then we go into the thought of resilience. So knowing that there's vulnerabilities, how do we have a strategy to deal with it, regardless of the fact that we can't prevent it, but yet we can still do things about it. So the cybersecurity group that I run at the lab, like I said, we really kind of focus on what are our core capabilities relative to other labs. And so mainly, NREL has an unusually high density of power systems engineers. So in terms of power systems engineers, market engineers, forecasting and planning engineers. So you just kind of put in like the whole scope of power systems, electrical delivery systems. Of those 2,300 people, it's really easy to get to 2,300 plus that just focus on the system of the interconnections. And so we really focus on supporting those folks in getting them to start thinking about security, or as they have security questions, us trying to work with them. We also have some very unique world-class research facilities I'll talk about later, as well as some unique tools. But most cybersecurity research groups, whether it's NREL or really any lab or even private industry, they tend to focus on specific categories of work. So one is vulnerability analysis. And so that's trying to go through your system and identify where are there vulnerabilities, where are there kind of readily available concerning actions I could take. And then mitigation modeling. So that gets into, there's lots of security solutions one could pick, but you always have limited budget on how to make those decisions. And so the mitigation modeling gets into studying specific systems, guessing what the vulnerabilities are or knowing specific vulnerabilities, and then really evaluating the mitigations to figure out how well do those mitigations really resolve those vulnerabilities and get to a reasonable level of risk. Situational awareness has to do with not necessarily preventing all this, but just having awareness. Having awareness I'm under attack. Having awareness whether or not my mitigations are being employed and how well they're working. It's an interesting sidebar that within attacks, right, a typical cyber attack will only last microseconds, seconds, minutes, but typically a response time on an attack is months, right? So let that sit in, right? So an attack happens in, say, minutes, right? And that's maybe long. The attack happens in minutes, but I don't even know about it, detect it, respond to it, do anything about it, possibly till many months later. And so that's obviously a really big problem. So situational awareness is really focused around building automated tools, displays, visualizations, data platforms to give folks a very quick real-time sense of what's going on in their system. Stakeholder engagement, that speaks towards work that we do on policy and standards and training. So the problem is being ready for an attack. So to be ready for an attack, you want to train people in an environment that's being attacked. But of course, you don't want to attack, you want anybody to attack your system while you're training them. But if it's not realistic, they may not be ready for the attack. And so we create environments on which we can replicate exact real systems in our own sandbox and then launch attacks at them and train operators on how to respond to those kinds of attack. Standards and policies has more to do with how to impact standards with science-based information on what kinds of things should go into a standard, what kinds of things should go into policy. The policy work is both domestic to the US, but also now emerging some level of assistance for external countries. So the meat of what this is, the Cybersecurity 101, is a way to kind of think through different types of threats, and then I'll build up just a little bit within cybersecurity. So again, cybersecurity is the buzzword. It's the thing that people most think about. It's clear and present. We see things like that going on, but it's important to recognize that that's just one piece of a basket of threats. And even this list isn't extensive, but this is a set of different threats that we look at. And so you can think about, you have natural threats and then what I call malicious or human threats. And so natural threats are, you have your normal, natural disasters and things like that the system has been built for, thought about, designed, and evolved for that. And I will say that even with all the work that's been done on that, there's still additional work that's being done, as you see, more deployment of microgrids, on-site storage, things like that to increase the resilience to natural disasters. But another thing that has come up, it hasn't affected us too great yet, but always can, and something that we have to keep present in our mind, is the idea of space weather. And by space weather, I mean electromagnetic disturbances that do happen with frequency, with varying levels of amplitude, but those, if of sufficient amplitude, could wreak havoc on the entire US electric system. And so studying space weather and what impacts it could have on the electric system especially becomes more interconnected. On the malicious side, we do think about cyber threats, but we also think about physical threats. And so the difference between those are, physical threats is somebody actually being physically present on a site, or for whatever reason deciding to fire off a couple of rounds at a critical device that maybe is critical to an entire system. And so with malicious threats, we think about both cyber, we also think about physical, and then we also think about EMP. So those are electromagnetic, which would be a little bit different than physically be there, but it would produce a phenomenon kind of similar to space weather that would be absolutely catastrophic to the electrical system. So to dive in a little bit into the cyber threats, again, the biggest thing to talk about is the evolution of the electric system, and there's tons of articles out about this. Not just the attacks that have occurred or were nearly successful, but also looking at that what's already occurred with the trajectory of where the system is going as it's becoming more interconnected, then the thing that particularly gets me on this slide is when you think about the ownership, right? We are evolving away from a scenario in which the utility owns everything, right? When the utility owns everything, when they own the generation, the transmission, the distribution, the meter, right? When it all works that way, you have a corporate entity that produces revenue by providing dependable electricity. With this evolution of folks adding photovoltaics to their home and chargers in their home, and controllable HVAC systems and EV charging stations in their home, and you're doing it on every neighborhood, or when you go to commercial campuses and more campuses are adding their own photovoltaics with their own EV charging with that. When you go into that path, if those systems, of course, aren't procured or somehow leased by the utility or some utility-like entity, and if they're privately owned, then it's not the utility's responsibility to secure that. And so that's to me the most fascinating or challenging security issue that's coming at us, is that it's not really the utility's responsibility to secure these devices. As people say, I want to go and produce my own electricity, but at the same hand too, they don't have the appreciation the way a utility does in terms of how secure all those things need to be. And the fact is, if an entire community privately owns an inverter, and let's just say they don't, there's a known exploit and they don't all patch it, and somebody comes in and doesn't knock off one home but knocks off an entire town, they can't rightfully go to the utility and say, well, this was your fault. And say, well, no, utility didn't own it. The utility's job is to provide electricity that comes into your home that you buy from them. They're, unless you've leased it through them, they're not responsible for this. So you're getting into some really interesting security challenges around how do we maintain the grid, how do we produce security, and also the fact that the role of the utility is different. And then also what's interesting is the role of your communication providers, your Comcast, your Verizon, right? Those big players who provide the communication interconnection, they now have a bigger role, like whether they directly are responsible for it, but they are hosting a lot of the communication that are controlling all of these devices. And so now the interplay between private ownership, communication industry, electricity industry, utilities is a really interesting challenge. So as you might have seen a variety of articles, cyber attacks are always increasing. What's probably the most concerning is the pivot towards those attacks not just happening on networks or banking infrastructure, but now the prevalence of those attacks happening on critical infrastructure. And so the Department of Energy recognizes a set of critical infrastructure and they subdivide them. If I recall, it was 13, but it's kind of changing all the time. But different areas of critical infrastructure, right? And so electricity is one of them. There's other ones around healthcare, finance, agriculture, I think manufacturing, so on and so forth. And so electricity is one of those critical infrastructures. But the particular thing that's concerning is the amount of attacks that are increasing on those. And also the original thought was, well, they're focused on the bulk power system, the substations, the coal plants, the nuclear plants. And that's true. But now you're seeing more things, published articles on attacks directly against photovoltaics, EV charging, wind. So the attacks are increasing, but they're also going after the newer technologies much faster. They're not kind of dwelling on the old stuff to see what they can do there. They're just kind of moving on to the new stuff. And then you combine that with what I talked about before in terms of private ownership. It's interesting space. So a couple of ways to think through cybersecurity, because it's a complex topic, is one thing I like to think through what is the objective? Like, what is the purpose? Like, why would somebody attack your system? I mean, we think, oh, they're just going to attack. They're going to attack anything. Well, right. I mean, they're going to attack for some reason. And so I think this slide is kind of a nice way of breaking down, like, what is the objective they're really after, right? And so one category is loss. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to take something away from the operator. So it's a little bit different than denial. It's kind of like loss of information, loss of control, loss of view. The next level down is denial. And so as you go down these get more and more concerning, because the loss of information is concerning, but I can kind of continue to operate because it's probably not uncommon that, just for various communication issues, network glitches, from time to time, I will lose information. So I have ways to ride through that. Denial is going even further. That's more perpetually preventing you from having information of your system, preventing you from being able to control your system, preventing you from maintaining maybe the safety of your system. That's bad. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything, but they've prevented you from doing what you need to do. The next level down is the really bad one. This is manipulation. So this isn't just taking the information away from you or preventing you from having it. This is taking everything away from you and then them having complete control. So the ability for them to change the information you're seeing. So you think you're seeing the information, but they're actually spoofing it so that you do something that would be really bad and you don't know it. Another thing is them just directly making changes on the system and you not being able to know or do anything about it. And of course, the really concerning thing is getting into the safety systems. So if they can get into the systems that are designed and intended to prevent catastrophic failure, that's the thing where it goes very, very badly. So these are kind of increasing levels.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes.
Jonathan, we have a question.
Great.
Kaylee asks, how do we overcome the challenges of assets being increasingly a web of private, public, or government run with evolving security attacks?
Today, I have no idea. That's an exaggerated statement. It's not I have no idea. I have some ideas on how we can go about it. But you are framing our most core research question that we propose in various contexts. How do we deal with this? I'm going to talk, if I have time, I'll talk about a project that really started to emphasize defining the problem. I mean, frankly, like we're at the stage of just defining, not just on a high level, oh, we have all these ownership and how do we do, but just defining like, what is the ownership really going to look like? Like what is the utility's responsibility? What is the private citizen's responsibility? What is those interplays? Where do standards line up? Where is there a gap? Like, is there going to be some kind of standard that's going to be required? So right now we're just kind of heavily in the defining the problem. But then the next step is yeah, what do we do about it? Some initial work that we've done in the topic is you have to give up the notion of I can just patch everybody's system because they own it. I can't force them to do it. They may not do it. They're not cyber. So I have to move to a model where I have defenses that identify I'm under attack and I have ways to respond to that attack, but I don't necessarily know what they're attacking, why they're attacking, and I'm going to provide the service. I'm going to continue to give everybody the electricity and the service as best as I can, and hopefully in a way in which they don't even know that they're under attack. And so from a detection, you look at machine learning algorithms that can tell you when something anomalous is going on. And then from a response, you go into autonomous systems who, based on a specific threat vector, will adapt how they're operating to block the attack, but still provide power. So basically, you'd have a model where all this is happening. The consumer wouldn't know that they're under attack, and they wouldn't know that it's responding to that attack. Is that a sufficient answer?
I liked it, Kaylee. Perfect. She said perfect. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, but you are, without that question, I'm not sure what our group does. I mean, that is the core question that all 25 people in different contexts think on. So another way to consider or kind of think through cybersecurity and how do people think through this is that there is a process that most attacks go through, how they get designed and developed and deployed and how they progress. This diagram here just kind of shows the different layers. And so on the right side, that's just a simple diagram of the different layers within a utility. right? So in terms of how you get from their enterprise system to their control system, down to their devices, down to the sensors, and how it progresses. And then on the left side, you have the different levels on which an attack gets, reconnaissance is just identifying what the vulnerability is. Weaponization is turning that vulnerability into a code, something that I can deploy, basically a weapon. Targeting is focusing that weapon on a specific asset in a specific system, delivery, exploiting. And so you move down these levels. And so this here just kind of shows you on the left side how an attack gets from design to being deployed and kind of moves all the way through. And really good attacks, not only do they progress all the way through, but then they clean their own tracks, so you don't even know you were attacked, right? So how do they do that? Then wipe everything, so you have no idea what happened. And so progressing through this, the right side is what are the different layers in your control system that they march down. Stuxnet, as everybody well knows, was one of the few things to successfully move down every single step of this kill chain. But it's a good way to think about it, because each one of these levels, not only is this what the attacker is doing, but there's something that you can do about each one of these levels. I'm not going to go through all this, except to say that this resource is available. This is a different order. So from left to right is kind of how an attack progresses. And then the rows give you examples of what occurs in those steps, and therefore ways in which you could devise solutions. And again, this is very relevant to like your specific system, as opposed to you have to do all this on every system. Like certain systems are more or less susceptible to these things based on how it's configured and what's on it and what the consequences are. So another kind of fundamental cybersecurity concept to introduce is this. So NIST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have a cybersecurity framework. It's probably the most referenced, most quoted framework. It's like the fundamental framework for thinking through cybersecurity. I would say not just in the US, but in the world. I mean, if you go to international stuff, you'll trace it and you'll find it references back to NIST. And it's NIST, so it's like a few 100-page document. But what it really boils down to is this. And so this is the way in which NIST recommends that you think through cybersecurity and your defenses. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So each one of these is a different phase of an attack. And you can think about it, it starts with identify, it goes to protect, detect, respond, recover. It goes around in a clockwise motion. And that kind of lines up with the levels of the kill chain. And so the point is that when you think through your cybersecurity threat, but also how you're going to defend against it, you do different things for different steps. So identify, you do certain kinds of things, protect, other things, detect, different things, respond, recover. So each one of these things have different solutions, not just technology solutions, but different training, different kinds of people that you need for these different phases. Okay. Before I go into just talking a little bit of some of the projects that we do in the group, I'll just pause to see if there's any other questions about any of what I had covered so far.
I don't see any questions right now.
All right, moving on. So I'm going to just a high level, not in any kind of detail, just talk about some of the kinds of projects. Oops, I see a question. Something about products. Something about.
Oh, looks like we do have a question.
Sure.
So, do you want to wait for the question? It has to do with their last slide.
Yeah, no, I think I see two questions. I think we'll address them both. So how should someone develop products, educate themselves on this topic? I'm trying to think of a simple way to answer that. As you can imagine, it's a very broad question. Let's hear some of the maybe the little bit more general ways I could think of to address that is the nice thing about the Department of Energy is all the work that we do that's funded by the federal government is public knowledge, it's publicly available. So if you're developing products on a specific system, if it was photovoltaics or EVs or wind turbines or ADMS, so Advanced Distribution Management System. If you're developing a product focused on one of those kinds of things, there's a wealth of knowledge in terms of both roadmaps for that technology, what kinds of cybersecurity solutions are needed, as well as there's a wealth of papers that are out there in terms of different vulnerability assessments that have been done and what the findings are. So the best thing I could say for that, it would be starting with the Department of Energy funded reports, also the academia, so university research that's happened, that's funded by DOE. All of the DOE research in that space is publicly available. That'd probably be the best place to start. But again, that's a very, I apologize, it's a very broad question. So hard to specifically answer that right now. Which of the NIST framework segments is the most difficult? Yeah, so the default answer is, all of them. But I'd say I'll answer a little bit different way in that a lot of funding and research has gone into the first few, so identify, detect, protect. The biggest emerging is the respond and recover, right? So for example, black start, right? Like how do we black start a grid? And also what I was talking about before, how do I identify I'm under threats, even though I can't really prevent them? And then how do I respond to them, right? I don't know what the attack is. I don't know why they're doing it, but I'm still going to respond to it regardless. I'm going to have some strategy for responding. One example could be taking, a big interconnected, system. Think of a neighborhood, and instead of it being one big neighborhood and there's an infection attacking one home, I subdivide it, right? If it's got solar and storage and all that, can I take that neighborhood and break it down into blocks or individual homes? And so instead of one target, now we've isolated them and they have to go after 100 or 200 homes to have a significant impact. So yeah, so I think the later stages, the ones that haven't had as much funding, haven't been as much work. So that's really where things are going. Great. Anything else? Okay. We'll move on. So a little bit about our group. So again, what we really focus on in our group is trying to think through how do you intrinsically build in security. So most of the systems that are built today, they were never envisioned to be interconnected, right? If you read back on the grid, I mean, really frankly, not that long ago, you had people who were actually switching, physically switching, at substations, devices. That was their job, was to flip relays and move things around, right? And so, automating substations is not, it wasn't 100 years ago we were doing that. It's more recent than that. So you got to think about the grid was originally designed, just to move power around. The idea of the fact of things being automatically controlled, run over, communication systems is not a thing that was in there in the beginning. And frankly, different providers are surely different, but even the system today lags, communication. So the point is that we may have way better communication protocols that are secure and all that, but because of legacy reasons, they may still be running very old, unsecure communications because they don't have funding and budget to convert it. They may have to run old operating systems. The joke about people still running Windows XP or whatever because it would cost millions of dollars to convert that machine over. So there's nothing that we can do about that. That's just the system we have. But what we can do is basically the Wayne Gretzky analogy of skate to where the puck is going, and by that think of where is the system going, how has it evolved, how is it modernizing. And for those systems, how can we make them secure? How can we get ahead and have those systems really positioned well to be safe and secure? And so our group really focuses around thinking over the horizon, thinking about where the system's going to go, what it's going to be like, how it's going to control, how can we make that secure? So one of the initial projects I'll talk about, I'm going to watch time here too. And this may be probably the most valuable to the attendees here. is that we were funded by the Federal Energy Management Program to create an online free, all right, let me repeat that, online free cybersecurity assessment tool. So it's called the Distributed Energy Resource Cybersecurity Framework. So it's dercf.nrel.gov. I can maybe somebody can put that in the notes or something like that. But this is a tool that anybody can go on, and you can do a self-assessment on your system. And so it will allow you to populate and put in your system and all your parameters however you want. And then you go through a series of questions and answers, and you don't have to do them all. It will give you feedback from the very first question you answer. It will start to give you feedback. But you go through these questions and you rate yourself on a 1 through 5 scale. And what happens is at the end of that assessment, it gives you a grading in what we call these kind of 3 pillars of security. So cyber governance, cyber physical security, and then physical security. So it's a quick, again, online, free tool that you can use to assess yourself. And then what it'll do, it'll give you a scorecard. So at the end of it, you have a sense of where is my cybersecurity possibly really strong, and where might I need additional investments. So it's really intended for the CTO or the CISO and the cyber team to work with the physical security team, right, to do this assessment. And it's a way, if you will, for the CISO, so the Chief Information Security Officer, or whoever has that hat. Sometimes the CTO, the CISO, the CEO, they're all the same person, right? I get that. But the point is it's a way for that person, or for people to give information to that person that they can justify investment and resources from the CFO and the COO and the CEO to say, look, this is where we're sitting, and this is where we're sitting relative to others, and I think we really need to prioritize this. It will also give you a top 10. So it'll say, based on what you've given us, here's the top 10 things that are most concerning about what you've done. At the end of the assessment, you can throw it away, so there's no record. If you choose, you can leave the record in there, so you can come back and do assessments in the future and compare yourself to those assessments, as well as if you contribute your information, it will get anonymized, and it will help with the kind of the baselining. So to help you understand where you are relative to everybody else, we need everybody to kind of say, where are they at in an anonymized way. So going beyond that, after an assessment, the next thing we really focused on is creating a stamp. Yep.
We got a question. Let's see. Is there one kind of alternative energy more at risk to cybersecurity disruption than others? And how does cyber risk to alternative energy systems and DERs compare to conventional energy?
Yeah. So I don't have an answer to number 1, and I'm not aware of anyone who has answered number 1. And frankly, it's a question we get all the time. It's a reasonable question, but it's actually really hard to answer because it assumes the attackers are the same. And really, every attacker is kind of a black swan. What are they interested in? What can they most perturb? So question 1 is actually, it's a great question. It's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer. Question 2 also comes up all the time. It's a very good question. It makes a lot of sense. Also incredibly difficult, much harder to answer than one would think. And so the way I answer it is kind of my non-answer, but it's to highlight that they're very different systems, right? So in a conventional system, I have staff, I have professionals, they sit there, they watch it, they are responsible for securing that and running it, and they reside at the coal plant or the nuclear plant or whatever, right? And so that's one situation. And you go to wind and solar and you say, well, there's nobody there and there's no security, and you can say, well, surely it's obvious, right? The alternatives are not as secure as coal. But think about it a different way. And I'm not saying alternatives are more or less secure. I don't know that answer. I've not heard of anybody who's answered. But they're very different, and there's advantages, right? Because in a coal plant, it's generally just 1 to maybe 3 turbines, right? And if I knock them off, it's done. And it's a ton of power that's gone. If I knock off a major substation, it's done. Jacqueline can talk to that. I mean, it is a big deal. But with wind, I don't have to just knock off one turbine. I have to knock off a few hundred. With photovoltaics, same thing, right? So I talk about the neighborhood analogy, but also think about it's non-trivial to attack all those homes. And especially when you think about, you have to do all that in a way in which my situational awareness tools don't identify that, you know, it's not like I'm seeing an anomaly on one turbine. I'm instantly seeing an anomaly on hundreds of turbines or an entire neighborhood. That's a huge signature. And my attack has to be so good that I'm knocking them all offline at the exact same time. Because if I knock one off and I identify that and I trigger and I respond to that, and I put all the rest of them into kind of some kind of secure lockdown mode, then maybe, you know, maybe the alternatives, I won't say are more secure, but they may not be any less secure. So really good question, difficult to answer. And I guess my only takeaway for you is they're just different. And so time will tell, how can we take advantage of those?
You know, Jonathan, I have a question too. You know, I have a Bluetooth enabled espresso machine, a smart thermometer, some solar panels. I mean, as we start seeing our houses become smarter, are we opening ourselves up to more kind of risk as far as, you know, and it doesn't even have to be so much as like a cyber attack, but just intrusion in general to get a hold of Ring doorbells or, you know, lighting or what have you?
Surely. Sure. I mean, surely your risk is increasing. Now, what will happen, right, is a whole nother question. But yeah, I mean, obviously I have small children. There's a conscious reason why I have no cameras in our home. Our baby monitor, I ensured that our baby monitor, although wireless, cannot connect to the network, right? So it's, you know, people have to navigate, right, comfort and convenience versus those kinds of decisions. I mean, we're introducing, you know, communication paths that didn't exist before, so that increases your risk. But as you said, you're increasing your risk. Risk is one piece of it. The question is, will it be exploited, and for what purposes and why? So that's the consequence. That kind of remains to be seen.
Okay.
So we're almost out of time. So I will mention, we work on building this platform to do a lot of the other projects. This platform is a way for us to virtualize real power systems. So like we could take, for example, Tri-State, and we could build up their electrical system, their communication system, running in real time. So it would look just like the normal system, but we build it up where it's mostly virtualized, but we also bring in physical assets from throughout our campus. So we're blessed with a few $100 million in power system toys, if you will. And we can bring them in and we can create these sandboxes to allow attacks or train operators or to study mitigations. And so that's a lot of the kinds of work that we do. We focus that work on a variety of topics. Skipping over that. So we've done a variety of things around photovoltaics, one looking at developing an inline encryption technology. We did another project here where we really looked at the evolution of an aggregator, which is different than electrical aggregation. An aggregator is the one who may be responsible for putting together all of the control, for example, in a neighborhood to as a system control photovoltaics. We also work on hydropower. We have a new project actually that we're just proposing now to secure hydropower, so utility-owned, privately owned hydropower as opposed to federally owned hydropower. So how can we increase the robustness of the cybersecurity and drive investments? So that's a project that we're just proposing now. So if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to talk offline about that. I'm happy to have you add to the proposal. We've also worked on geothermal, so trying to understand what unique vulnerabilities exist in geothermal systems, right, which are kind of interesting. you say, oh, there's nothing. Well, there's some unique things about geothermal that don't exist in other systems. Also EV charging. So not as much focused on the vehicle, but starting to think about the charging system, because if I can attack the charging system, then can I compromise every vehicle that touches it. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that a lot of what we do is we leverage also some physical assets. So NREL is blessed of the 17 labs. We have a 2 megawatt, 185,000 square foot systems integration facility. It was built with a few $100 million specifically to do this kind of work at the grid edge. And then we have the Flatirons campus that many of you might have seen. If you see a small set of turbines on your drive from Denver to Boulder, that's called the Flatirons campus. And so that is a 20 megawatt playground. So not only do we study and emulate and model stuff, but we actually hit real physical systems with attacks, see what their response is. So with that, we're right at time.
Okay, we have another question come in.
Sure.
Are there any critical areas that a company in energy should be looking at to mitigate risk?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And that question, again, that's a big question. And I will say that as we do these, we've done a lot of assessments. I think we've done 30 some assessments with different companies. It's always company specific. It's not like, here's the thing, and every company needs to do that. That's where that cyber assessment, again, the free online tool, where that comes into play. Is that helps you take the massive question you just asked and break it into specific pillars, of which there's specific topical areas, and then figure out what's the area that you really need to focus on. That tool is specific to distributed energy resources, but it's using the tool, it would be relevant to assessing an entire electrical system. The questions are more or less the same, but that would be a way of trying to answer your question.
Right. Do you guys have, or do you maybe can speak to kind of some real world examples of when these threats have come through and like worked? That kind of gives you a baseline on, oh, wow, that happened. Now we should go back and take a look.
Sure. Some of that information is not publicly shareable, unfortunately. But I would just recommend that there's quite a dearth of public information on attacks that have happened fairly recently against photovoltaics and wind systems. I believe that there was some new attacks against distribution systems. So again, I just recommend that most of that is something that you can find. Like I said, just tracking the news. There are different cybersecurity bulletins that are put out from various government agencies. There's daily briefs, and I believe that you all would have access to those mailing lists, and so that would be something to sign up with. But it's unfortunately frequent, but there hasn't been that big kind of dramatic thing that's happened. But the trick is do we really want to wait for that big thing to happen to deal with this, especially if we look at our systems and we know that it's possible?
All right, any other questions? Looks like I'm not seeing any come in.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this for us. Really appreciate it.
Right.
Sally, you have anything else to say?
No. Thank you again, Jonathan. We really appreciate it.
All right. You all have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, thank you.